to the Video Games Hall of Justice, where the loving memories of the world's most remembered Amiga games are put on trial and given a chance to prove their worth, once and for all. This is Judge and Jury. All rise, Judge Drokk presiding. In this courtroom we will examine the cult status and time-honored legacy of some of the Amiga's most revered titles. And with the help of a jury of experts in their field, we'll offer a final verdict as to whether the legacy of the titles on trial are indeed justified. In the court of justice today are two titles that will be no stranger to any Amiga owner: Speedball and Speedball II. Released in an era when bigger, better, faster, more was no longer good enough. We had to send them into space, or even the future. Even James Bond and the Milky Bar Kid went into space. So why not ball games? There's no way the Bitmap Brothers were not inspired by the likes of the 1975 film Rollerball, itself a goldmine of ideas to later comics such as the 1977-2000 AD with its Harlem Heroes strip. Commodore 64 players thought their dreams had come true when Rocket Ball landed in their laps. A nice try, but they were still left wanting. The Bitmap Brothers answered their prayers in 1988, and shortly after, as they had with Xenon, followed up with a sequel that dialed up the gloss and maxed out the aesthetic impact. Now in 2022 the legacy lives on, but is it justified? Does this game still bust balls, or are we only remembering the old victories? The jury shall decide. Now let's meet the defendants.
Hey everyone, I'm Mark Macrae, originally from London, England, now residing in Wellington, New Zealand. I'm a massive fan of anything Commodore 64, Amiga and arcade gaming related, and I'm also a contributing writer and editor for the ZZAP Amiga magazine from Fusion Retro. I'm also delighted to be discussing classic Amiga games on this channel, which I hold in such high regard.
Hey everybody, Bastish B here for the 64K YouTube channel. I'm originally from South Africa and now live in Canada, and I'm so glad to be finally making a series about classic Amiga gaming.
Hi, my name is David-Motowylak. I live in the United States and I've been a long-time Amiga fan since I purchased my first Amiga 500 back in 1988.
You may now present your evidence.
First up, I always like to provide a little background on these games from a United States perspective, as the Amiga was certainly not as popular here compared to other regions. Speedball was released by Imageworks in most of the world, but in the US the game came here under a publisher called Spotlight Software, which was a secondary label for Cinemaware. They were the creators of Defender of the Crown, Rocket Rager, It Came from the Desert, and many other quality titles. This label published a handful of European-created games for the US market from 1989 to 1990. Only 8 games were published under this label. By the time the game hit the shelves in America, many of us were already familiar of the game through other methods, but it was still nice to see an official USA release of the game.
Both the original Speedball and Speedball II I first played on my Commodore 64 long before playing the Amiga versions. They were both honestly pretty good conversions, not as flashy as their big Amiga counterparts, but still cool nevertheless. But eventually played the Amiga versions in the late 90s when I got my system. Bootleg versions, of course.
I remember when Speedball was first reviewed in magazines and it reminded me of that 70s movie Rollerball. I'm sure it must have been the inspiration for the game.
Brutal Deluxe came out in 1990, 2 years after the original. This time, Konami published the game in the United States.
The hype around Speedball 2 Brutal Deluxe was super intense. Every publication was singing its praises universally across the board, with 90% and above scores. It really made me jealous that I didn't have an Amiga at that time.
Kind of imagine a scene at the Bitmap Brothers one day, maybe after the champagne had sort of settled down from the release of Speedball, and the boss going, right lads, now take Speedball, which is an amazing game, but we want a better intro, expand the game and provide some strategic elements, and take the graphics to another level. Okay boss, we'll do our best. Well, they did it.
Speedball was one of those memorable releases for the Amiga that everybody wanted to play. It was a beautiful game, an arena sports title set in the future where everything is made of steel. The floors are steel, the walls are steel, and even the player uniforms are made of hard metal. The graphics had that awesome futuristic look, something that the Bitmap Brothers started with Xenon, but it took it to the next level in this game.
The presentation is fantastic. It still looks really good even now. Detailed, metallic, typical Bitmap Brothers design with smooth scrolling, and the menu's just got that cool futuristic look to it. For a 1988 game, it's visually really aged well.
Wow, I remember being blown away when that title screen appears with the fist and that David Whittaker tune blasts out. The graphics still look amazing today, but back then they were exceptional.
David Whittaker almost never disappoints when it comes to game music, both on the C64 and Amiga, although his original Xenon tune is pretty mediocre. But this tune is absolutely rocking, and it sits right up there with some of his best Amiga compositions like Shadow of the Beast, Blood Money, Obliterator, and so much more.
Now let's be honest, everybody references Speedball 2 as the best game in the series, but I think there's plenty to say about the original title as well. While the game is less complicated and contains less features compared to Speedball 2, in some ways this is a benefit. There are 5 players per team compared to 9 in the sequel, which I think makes the game a little easier to follow.
Playing field in Speedball is a single screen wide and scrolls up and down. It's quite limiting when compared to its sequel, but again I actually prefer the simplicity, especially these days when I fire up just a single player knockout or a 2-player game.
Speedball is much easier to manage with the small amount of players in the team and the zoomed out view, giving you a much clearer look at the field, but then at the same time it loses that close-up gritty detail you get in the sequel, and personally it feels a little empty to me.
It is an excellent game in its own right, and allows for some impressive skill shots if you time it perfectly. There's a tunnel in the center of the playfield where if you throw the ball into it, it will come out from the other side. Kind of reminds me of Pac-Man. If you hit the ball against the wall, it will bounce off, and if you can make a score that way, it is super satisfying.
I just love the simplistic gameplay of the original Speedball, and I actually prefer it over the sequel. It's so easy to just pick up and play.
I do like Speedball. It's a well-crafted and put-together game. I just don't think it's as intense and as gritty, and definitely not as memorable as the sequels, though I probably wouldn't come back to it very often.
The Bitmap Brothers went all out on this one, adding a larger playfield, more players on the field, and better animation.
The graphics are on another level, some of the best ever seen on the Amiga, and to think everything fit into a stock Amiga 500 is quite an amazing feat.
Whenever anyone ever mentions the name Speedball, images of Part 2 Brutal Deluxe are the first thing that come to my mind. Just like the Bitmap Brothers' second Xenon game, which really found its style and cult audience, this one did exactly the same.
With the larger pitch, the game requires a lot more skill in passing, dodging, and bouncing the ball off the wall. And also, the game feels a lot more alive with more crowd noises and cheers, and voice samples.
Way more detail and animation on the players, and you can see a lot more of what's really going on. For example, when you get floored by a right hook from an opposing player.
The graphics in this are sublime, typical Bitmap Brothers metallic look taken to the next level with amazing detail. Having grown up on the more zoomed out Commodore 64 version, seeing this in motion for the first time was stunning. It feels initially a little bit disorientating not being able to see most of the arena, but it becomes second nature real quick with the awesome flow of the action.
It's a very fast-paced game that plays very well and is very stylish. You can score a goal by throwing the ball into the goal, hit the 5 stars on the side of the playfield, or brutally injure a player on the opposing side. There is also a management system that allows you to enhance various qualities of your team. It takes some trial and error, but the options do make a difference and can affect your overall game.
Speedball is a much faster and simpler affair, and great to spin up, especially with 2 players, but it's still quite brutal. Speedball 2 is a bigger game with more strategy and the whole team to think about rather than just yourself, rather like the difference between 5-a-side and 11-a-side football.
The music here is of special note, a lot more bolder and louder and feels more science fiction styled and metallic, fitting in with the style of the game perfectly, by Nation 12, who also did the music in the Bitmap Brothers Gods game. And not to be forgotten is the excellent sound effects that bring the whole thing to life by Richard Joseph.
My only complaint is that the selection of the active player is automatic, and sometimes the AI doesn't pick the best player.
There's a lot of nuances to this game, especially on the management side, which we haven't really even touched on, which just makes this game a whole lot more interesting and intriguing than the original.
Speedball 2 is often considered to be one of the best games on the Amiga, so there's no question that the game will get a justified rating. It's one of those games you can pick up and play today and have a fun time. It's a sports game for people who don't usually care for the genre. It should be noted that the game was converted to many other systems, but I feel the Amiga port is the best computer version of the game. Still, I want to also give props to the original. While it paved the way for the sequel, there is still a lot to like. It is a more simple game, but sometimes that is a good thing. My verdict for both games is justified.
For me, Both these games are classics and deserve a justified label, but probably controversially, I prefer the original game for its simplicity and it's more nostalgic to me.
Like mentioned earlier, I grew up on the C64 versions, which I really enjoyed, although these Amiga versions are the definitive ones to play. The original is good and I feel is the blueprint for the vastly superior sequel. Both though are well-crafted games, and for me, their legacy is justified.
And the verdict is justified. The court is now adjourned. All rise and we'll see you again soon for the next case.